Every nation on Earth is drowning in debt. The United States owes roughly $38 trillion. Japan owes about $9 trillion. Worldwide, the figure surpasses $315 trillion, more than 3 times the size of the global economy itself. Numbers this large should feel impossible. They should provoke panic. They should force us to ask a question so obvious that economists almost never say it out loud. If everyone owes money, then who exactly is owed? The intuitive answer is that some powerful external creditor must be sitting above the system, quietly collecting interest from the entire planet. But once you trace the flow of obligations, once you examine who holds which bonds and why, the picture becomes far stranger and far more unsettling. Because there is no outside creditor. There is no entity standing beyond the borders of nations holding the world's IOUs. The world owes money to itself. Governments hold other governments' bonds. Corporations buy sovereign debt as safe collateral. Pension funds depend on government securities to guarantee retirements. Banks lend to one another, backed by the very debt governments issue. Every liability in one corner of the system appears as an asset somewhere else. What looks like a mountain of obligations is actually a web, dense, tangled, and self-referential. No one can step outside it, because there is no outside left. And this is the point people miss. Debt isn't a malfunction of the system. Debt is the system. Money is created when governments borrow. Credit expands when banks issue loans. Bonds serve as currency for institutions. If the world paid off its debts tomorrow, the global money supply would collapse, trade would freeze, economies would implode. The paradox becomes disturbing when you realize it wasn't an accident. Over 3 centuries, financial engineers built a structure in which debt is permanent, rollover is mandatory, and repayment is neither expected nor desired. So the question isn't, who is owed? The real question, the one the system depends on you never asking, is who profits from the endless flow of interest? And once you start following that stream upward, the architecture of power begins to reveal itself. If the global debt paradox is the world we now inhabit, then the obvious question becomes, where did this architecture begin? Systems do not emerge fully formed. They are built, brick by brick, idea by individuals who glimpse an opportunity others overlook. And the first architect of the system we live under today, a system where debt is not a temporary burden but the very engine of money itself, was a Scottish merchant named William Paterson. His innovation in 1694 did more than finance a war. It rewired the financial DNA of civilization. Before Paterson, sovereign debt was a crude, almost medieval affair. Kings borrowed when they needed cash and repaid when they could. When they could not, they defaulted. Creditors lost money. The slate was wiped clean. Debt ended. It was a cycle, not a structure. But England, in the late 17th century, faced a crisis that cycles could no longer solve. At war with France and discredited by past defaults, King William III stood on the brink of financial collapse. Traditional lenders refused him. The treasury was empty. The state was running out of time. Paterson offered a proposal so radical it barely resembled lending at all. He assembled a syndicate of wealthy merchants willing to provide £1.2 million, a staggering sum, on one condition. The principal would never be repaid. The Crown would pay 8% interest forever, backed not by royal promise, but by Parliament's taxation authority. It was a loan transformed into an annuity, a revenue stream guaranteed by the very existence of the state. To manage this perpetual arrangement, Paterson created something entirely new: the Bank of England. The merchants deposited their gold. The bank lent it to the government. The government collected taxes to pay interest. And the merchants received tradable notes that functioned both as claims on the government and as money because they yielded predictable, state-backed returns. The true revolution wasn't the loan itself. It was the mechanism. Government debt became an asset. Assets became money. Money creation became inseparable from state borrowing. And once this structure existed, it was impossible to return to the old world of temporary, finite debt. Paterson didn't just fund a war. He institutionalized permanent sovereign debt, embedding taxpayers into a system where interest flows endlessly upward and where repayment is never the goal, only perpetuation. And from this foundation, the next architect would expand the system far beyond England's borders. Paterson had laid the foundation. Debt would no longer end. But a structure built in one kingdom cannot reshape the world. For the debt system to become truly inescapable, it needed something England alone could not provide. It needed scale. It needed reach. It needed an architect capable of stretching Paterson's blueprint across an entire continent, turning a national mechanism into an international web. And in the early 19th century, one man possessed the network, the vision, and the audacity to do exactly that. Nathan Mayer Rothschild. Europe at the time was borrowing more frequently, but its financial markets were fragmented, small pools of capital, inconsistent terms, slow communication, and isolated lenders. Governments depended on individual bankers or local elites, each loan negotiated separately, each crisis contained within borders. Debt was permanent, yes, but still provincial. Rothschild changed that overnight. Through the five-city Rothschild network, London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples, he built the first truly international financial machine. Couriers raced across borders with information faster than diplomats, faster than generals, faster than governments themselves. Bonds moved across Europe not as static documents but as living instruments, bought and sold in a fluid secondary market Rothschild effectively created. Instead of lending money directly, he purchased sovereign bonds at a discount, then distributed them to investors in every major capital, binding nations together through shared risk. The turning point came in 1815. Rothschild's agents learned of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo hours before London. With that knowledge, he manipulated the British bond market, first signaling fear, then buying aggressively when prices collapsed. It wasn't merely a profit coup, it was a demonstration of information as financial power. From that moment, governments understood a new reality. Control of sovereign debt depended on controlling the flow of information and the channels through which bonds moved. And here lies the deeper significance. Once Rothschild globalized sovereign debt, default ceased to be a bilateral matter. A failure in one country threatened banks, pensioners, insurers, and investors across Europe. A missed payment no longer harmed a lender, it destabilized the system. Sovereign bonds became the collateral of empires. Rothschild became the gatekeeper. And governments, no matter how proud or powerful, found themselves locked into a new dynamic. To preserve stability, they had to borrow continuously, service their debts religiously, and avoid default at all costs. Patterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global and impossible to escape without shaking the world itself. Rothschild had transformed sovereign debt into a sprawling continental web, a system so interconnected that no nation could default without shaking its neighbors. But for the next stage of the debt architecture to take shape, the system needed something even more powerful. Permanence was not enough. Globalization was not enough. The system needed infinity, a mechanism that would ensure governments could borrow forever, without limit, without meaningful constraint, without ever confronting the old boundaries of gold, liquidity, or market appetite. And the man who would build this third pillar of the debt machine was an American banker whose influence rivaled monarchs, J.P. Morgan. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States was a rising economic titan with a dangerously primitive financial system. Thousands of independent banks operated with almost no coordination. Credit was unstable. The money supply was shackled to gold reserves, rising and falling with the whims of mining output. Panic swept the nation again and again, culminating in the crisis of 1907 when markets collapsed, banks failed, and the U.S. economy teetered on the edge. With no central bank to intervene, the nation turned not to government but to one man. Morgan locked the leading bankers in his library and forced them to commit their own capital to rescue the system. It worked. But it also exposed an uncomfortable truth. A modern industrial superpower could not depend on a private banker to prevent collapse. Morgan and his allies understood that the next crisis could be fatal. They needed a permanent, institutionalized mechanism to stabilize markets and, more importantly, to expand credit on demand. So, in 1910, under the cover of secrecy so intense participants used first names only, a small group of bankers and Senator Nelson Aldrich met on Jekyll Island to design the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve System. The brilliance of the plan lay in its disguise. It would appear public, but function privately. It would appear decentralized, but be controlled by the financial elite. Member banks would own the regional reserve banks. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, dominated by Wall Street, would hold the true power, the ability to create money and purchase government bonds. When Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, everything changed. For the first time, the U.S. government had a lender that could buy its debt with money created out of nothing. Demand for government bonds became infinite. Deficits became irrelevant. Debt became the engine of money creation itself. Patterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. By 1913, Morgan had given the world a mechanism for infinite debt creation. Governments no longer needed to fear the limits of gold or the reluctance of private lenders. The central bank would always stand ready to buy their bonds. But infinite debt introduces a new risk: inflation. If money can be created endlessly, its value can erode just as quickly. And by the 1970 seconds after decades of war spending, social programs, and the final abandonment of the gold standard, the world faced a new kind of crisis: Prices surged. Currencies wobbled. The credibility of the U.S. dollar, the anchor of the global financial system, began to slip. If Patterson built the foundation, if Rothschild stretched it across continents, if Morgan gave it infinite scale, then the next architect would determine whether the system survived its own excesses. That architect was Paul Volcker. When Volcker took over as Federal Reserve Chair in 1979, inflation in the United States hovered above 10%. Confidence was crumbling. So, Volcker chose the most brutal tool in the central banker's arsenal. He raised interest rates to levels no one had imagined possible, peaking near 20%. Inflation collapsed. The dollar's credibility was restored. But the shockwave did not stop at America's borders. Throughout the 1,970 seconds, developing countries had borrowed heavily in U.S. dollars, encouraged by low interest rates and flush global liquidity. When Volcker's rate hikes hit, their debt burdens exploded overnight. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil, $60 billion. Argentina, $40 billion. Suddenly, their interest payments exceeded their export revenues. And in August 1982, Mexico announced it could not pay. A default on that scale threatened to drag down the entire Western banking system. Citibank, Chase, Bank of America, they all held massive exposure. The logical market outcome would have been default, liquidation, and loss. But Volcker and U.S. officials refused to allow it. Instead, they turned to a new instrument of global financial control, the International Monetary Fund. The IMF offered rescue loans not to forgive the debt, but to keep interest flowing to American banks. In return, debtor nations were forced into structural adjustment. Austerity, privatization, deregulation, currency devaluation. These programs dismantled economic sovereignty in exchange for the right to continue servicing unpayable debts. Volcker completed the system the earlier architects began. Patterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. Volcker made it inescapable even when nations could no longer pay. Volcker had ensured that even unpayable debt would never be allowed to die. But if his intervention preserved the system in the 1,980 seconds, it also revealed something deeper. Sovereign debt was no longer just a political tool or a financial instrument. It had become the circulatory system of the global economy itself. And once you understand this, you understand why the modern world cannot function without perpetual borrowing. What the early architects built, and what Volcker safeguarded, has now matured into a mechanism so vast and so interconnected that debt is not merely part of the system, it is the system. Today, every nation finances its operations through bonds. These bonds do not sit idle. They become the foundation stones of modern finance, held by banks to meet regulatory requirements, by pension funds to secure retirements, by insurance companies to guarantee payouts, and by central banks as the core of their reserves. But here is the crucial detail. Governments do not repay these debts in any conventional sense. They roll them over, endlessly. Old bonds mature, new ones replace them, and the cycle continues without interruption. The system's stability depends on that continuity. A pause in refinancing is not an inconvenience, it is an existential threat. Central banks reinforce this cycle. The Federal Reserve, the ECB, the Bank of Japan each purchases sovereign bonds to control interest rates, inject liquidity, and calm markets. Their willingness to buy ensures that governments never lack financing. The result is a credit pyramid layered upon sovereign debt. Banks use government bonds as collateral to borrow. Hedge funds leverage them. Corporations depend on them as benchmark assets. Every layer rests on the assumption that government debt is eternal, stable, and universally accepted. Globally, the interconnections form a web so dense that no thread can be removed without tearing the fabric. The U.S. holds European bonds. Europe holds American debt. Japan finances the U.S. Treasury. China holds Western and Asian obligations. Developing nations owe the IMF and World Bank. Everyone is creditor and debtor simultaneously. In such a world, a sovereign default is not a national event, it is a planetary threat. And this reveals the final truth of the mechanism. Repayment is irrelevant. What matters is servicing the continuous flow of interest from taxpayers to institutions. That flow keeps markets liquid, banks solvent, and the global economy alive. Without perpetual borrowing, the entire machine would seize. Debt began as a tool. Now it is the architecture of the world. If debt has become the architecture of the modern world, then the next question is unavoidable. If borrowing never ends, if governments refinance eternally, if interest payments flow without pause, who receives that flow? Because a system this vast, this intricate, this dependent on perpetual motion must have beneficiaries. And when you follow the stream of money upward, past the taxpayers who fund it, past the governments that administer it, past the central banks that stabilize it, you eventually arrive at the quiet apex of the structure, the institutions that hold the debt itself. Despite the public's perception that national debt is a shared burden, its rewards accumulate in very specific hands. Consider the United States. Roughly half of all federal debt is owned by domestic institutions, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, commercial banks, and, crucially, the Federal Reserve. These institutions do not see government bonds as burdens. They see them as safe, interest-bearing assets, anchoring trillions in portfolios. When taxpayers send over $1 trillion per year in interest to the federal government, that money does not vanish. It is transferred methodically, predictably, silently into the accounts managed by the largest asset managers in the world: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. Even when these bonds are held for the public, the profits from trading, management fees, and institutional leverage accumulate overwhelmingly at the top. Another portion of U.S. debt is owed internally to government trust funds like Social Security and Medicare. But this does not lessen the burden. It merely shifts it. When those programs eventually redeem their bonds, future taxpayers must cover the payouts, or the government must issue even more debt to meet its own obligations. The cycle tightens. Globally, the pattern replicates itself with eerie symmetry. Japan's enormous public debt is held largely by domestic banks and the Bank of Japan. Europe's sovereign obligations sit in the portfolios of major financial institutions and the European Central Bank. China's government debt is held primarily by state-owned banks. In every case, interest payments rise from workers and citizens and concentrate in financial institutions, public or private, positioned at the top of the system. This is why the mechanism rarely sparks political outrage. The transfer is concealed under bureaucratic language like debt service, a term that hides the reality beneath it. For governments, debt is necessary. For institutions, it is profitable. For taxpayers, it is permanent. And so the upward flow of interest becomes the quiet engine of modern finance, powering a system few ever see and even fewer truly benefit from. If interest flows upward, quietly enriching the institutions perched at the top of the financial hierarchy, then the final question emerges naturally. How did the world end up inside a system that funnels value in this direction, and why can't nations simply walk away? To answer that, we must zoom out from the parts and look at the machine as a whole. Because when you connect the elements built across centuries, Patterson's permanent debt, Rothschild's global markets, Morgan's central bank engine, and Volcker's international enforcement, you begin to see not isolated financial reforms, but a fully assembled architecture, a structure so deeply embedded that attempting to exit it would be indistinguishable from tearing down the global economy itself. Patterson ensured that sovereign debt would never truly be repaid. Rothschild ensured that no nation could default without destabilizing its neighbors. Morgan ensured that governments would never run out of buyers for their bonds, because central banks could create money to purchase them. And Volcker ensured that even when countries collapsed under the weight of their obligations, the system would step in not to forgive the debt, but to preserve it through rescue programs and restructuring. Piece by piece, century by century, crisis by crisis, the system hardened. By the time the modern era arrives, the logic is unmistakable. Governments must borrow to prevent deflation, to stabilize banking systems, to fund basic operations. Financial institutions must hold government bonds because they serve as collateral, as benchmarks, as the safest of safe assets. Central banks must rely on sovereign debt to conduct monetary policy. Money itself is born from government borrowing. Eliminate the debt, and you eliminate the currency created by it. The entire system balances on a paradox. The world cannot repay its debts without destroying the money needed to repay them. And because nations hold one another's bonds, a major default today would trigger cascading failures around the globe. This is not conspiracy. It is the predictable outcome of centuries of interconnected design choices, each intended to solve immediate problems, but collectively producing a structure that requires perpetual expansion to survive. In this fully assembled system, interest becomes the rent societies pay to keep the machinery running, not out of malice, but out of dependency. Debt is no longer a flaw, nor a temporary burden. It is the foundation upon which the modern economic order stands, and the trap from which no nation can exit without bringing the entire structure down with it. If you found this analysis valuable, leave a comment and share your perspective below. Subscribe and like the video to support the channel and receive future deep dive content exploring how financial systems are built, who benefits from them, and what they mean for the world ahead.